Thank you, Christine. I'll accept the recording here. Okay, so Christine, thank you again for introducing me. This year, of course, was our first legal year of growing hemp in Ohio. Last year, we actually did a research plot down in Adams County, and we really was just what this crop is. We didn't have a whole lot of time to get a plan put together and research trials actually set up. So it was more of a raw learning experience for us. And what we learned from last year was this was definitely going to be a very finicky crop in terms of healthy production, but also in terms of marketing and making money off of this crop. So what we're going to dive into today is we're going to talk a little bit about the process of getting started and what some of those costs are up front and what some of those procedures are. And we'll also, what I plan to do is just kind of walk you through. I've been working with several producers in the county. By several, I mean 3, and I think that's several for me. That's enough because it's very time consuming. And I just want to go through the very beginning stages all the way until where we're at today. That way you can see what it takes pretty much week in and week out. So we're going to try and outline that. But before we dive too far into it, any discussion on and maybe get a feel for the room? Is there anybody that grew this year? I don't think we have anybody in here that were a grower this year, or anyone that's planning to grow next year. Feel free to unmute yourself. I want to have an open discussion, if that's okay, Christine, of just question and answer throughout too. I'm okay with that.
I just see some activity in the chat box. Tracy
okay.
says no.
Okay. I can't see the chat box, so if you can monitor that for me, that'd be great.
Sure, will do.
So we'll just kind of I'm going to go from the aspect of this is going to be the very first time you are even considering growing hemp. So I'm going to kind of start from the basic and show you everything that we're going through. And I was just wondering if anybody else had experiences this year that they'd like to share. So before we get started, I think I'm going to throw a lot of abbreviations out here. So THC and CBD, of course, you're going to hear that a lot in this presentation. So the THC is a tetrahydrocannabinol, and essentially this is what we have to keep in check. And we're going to talk about the Ohio regulations here in just a second, but this is the compound that is really responsible for most of the hallucinogenic effects caused by marijuana. So then we have to think, what's the difference between hemp and marijuana? Looking at it, what's the difference? There's absolutely no difference. The only difference is the THC level. So hopefully we know that at this point, especially if you're considering growing. And that was kind of one of the questions I talked to our producers in the county. I said, hey, what's one thing, if you're going to be talking to a new grower, that they need to know before going into it? They said, do your homework, learn about this crop, not only how to produce it, but learn about the biology of this crop and how it functions and really what the makeup of this plant is, because that's what you're selling. We're marketing not just the crop material. We're not just harvesting the grain off of it. In some cases we are. We're not just making forage off of it. In terms of CBD production, we're actually extracting those plant materials that plant's made up of and marketing that out. So we really have to get a good understanding of how this plant functions. And Christine, as you mentioned in your beginning or in your intro online and on social media, this is an older crop. It was previously grown in the 18th and 19th centuries, and then the Controlled Substance Act actually made it illegal to have in possession after 1978. So before it was used a lot for fibers. We didn't have much production outside of that until it got out of control, and then they had to set some regulations on it. And then we brought it back to Ohio the first year. In Kentucky, they've been growing this for the last 4 or 5 years now. So they've had a little bit more experience with this. But again, and talking to producers this year, one of the biggest hurdles before you even get started is the cost of applying and getting started itself before you even put plants into the ground. So this is from the Ohio Department of Agriculture's website. You can find all this information, have a link on the next page on their website. I'm not going to dive too much into detail on the application process or the processing process or any of that. I just kind of want to give you a heads up this is your first time looking at this, these numbers can be pretty mind-boggling. You know, you look at this, it's like, wow, I had no idea. I thought I was just going to buy a few plants and put them in the ground and hopefully turn a little bit of a profit off of them. But and another thing that they told us is you have to make a budget. We talked about this multiple times during all of our presentations back in the fall before trying to prepare growers. Lay out your money and lay out what you expect costs to be. And we can't do that if we don't know what the application looks like. And so this year, ODA came out with their rules. It's $500 per year for each growing location for a cultivator's license. So that's if you're planning on growing. Now, this is valid for 3 years, but you still have to pay that $500 each year. So every 3 years, you just have to go back in and renew your license to the Ohio Department of Ag.
James, I have a question.
Yes. Yes.
How do they determine if it's a separate location?
So, and you know, they may be able to explain it a little more precise than I can, but essentially it's a contiguous property, right? So if you have a field on the east side of on Route 223, okay, and then you want to just jump across the road, still your property, keep in mind, but you want to jump across the road and plant another 2 acres, those are 2 separate growing locations. So that's going to be a separate $500 fee for each one of those growing locations. Now, if you submit your application and you pay your $500 and you get your location reported, and then you want to make adjustments to that, I believe it's a $250 fee to make adjustments to a prior established location. So that's important to know too. Once you make up your mind, that's a big decision we have to make up front. This is where I'm going to have it. This is the location I want, and I'm not going to change it. And if so, we're looking at $250 to $500 to make that decision. Now, processors. Well, I guess I should say in Ohio, I can't remember the exact number off my head, but I think we're 90, 95 growers that were licensed in Ohio. I don't know how many actually planted in Ohio. I know it wasn't that high. We typically don't see all of the applicants plant. So Kentucky, we're talking they had thousands of growers. So I think we kind of were watching what the markets did in Kentucky, which they severely dropped off this winter, and we'll show you some slides on that towards the end. But we were watching, we played it smart in Ohio. We knew that the market just wasn't quite there yet for us, and we had far fewer growers in Ohio. Now processing, this is where it becomes very expensive. And this is the processing for extracting the CBD from that plant. Of course, the machinery to do that is super expensive, but also the processing license is $3,000 for that. Now, if you're doing grain and fiber, I believe that processing is $500 for that application. The application fee itself is $100. So your license is $500, and then your application is $100 just to submit your application. Now, the THC testing is free for the first time in your first variety. So that's also important when we're planning this out. A lot of people, and for good reason, well, I mean, anyone would. This is your first year of growing it. So we want to try all the different varieties out at the time, right? I know many grain producers of corn and soybean that are going to plant several varieties on their farm and see which one works better for the next year. With this, we have to pay a separate THC testing cost at the end of the year if we plan to plant different varieties. So we can plant them, no problem. But when it comes towards the end of the year, you have to remember that you're going to get caught up with some THC testing costs, because I believe that is, I may be wrong on this, don't quote me. I think we're at $150 for an additional test for them to come back out and test an additional variety. So keep that in mind too. If you go out and plant 4 varieties, that's the cost you're adding up. And then of course you have to have a BCI background check completed before you can plant. And that cost, I think, is around $20 to $30. I think they're $22 in Ohio. But again, a small cost that can add up. So we're looking anywhere between, before we even buy our plants, buy the plastic, which we'll get into, $600 to $700 right up front for a grower to get established. Any questions on that?
I'm watching the chat.
Okay.
If we get one, I'll let you know.
Okay. Okay, so now just kind of some of the basic rules. Again, we got to keep it below 0.3% THC. I mentioned the difference between hemp and marijuana is that THC level. There it is right there. We have to be below 0.3%. And as a grower this year, you talk about putting all this money into it. We're going to talk about the total cost here towards the end. And if that goes above 0.3% THC, you have to destroy that entire crop. That entire crop is deemed non-marketable. So at that point, you have to, let's kind of, before I jump too far ahead, so we have to keep testing that THC level, but we don't have really the ability to do that in Ohio on an economical basis. We don't have a whole lot of testing facilities. So if you call ODA down, their first time's free. Every time after that's $150. So you don't want to pay that to test it every week to see where it's at. So in the back of your mind, that's playing in your head the whole time as you're putting money and time into this, is what are my THC levels? And that's something we tried to help with this year, and we'll show you some examples there. But so you call ODA or you report on your dashboard online that you are ready for harvest. And they come down, test. You have 15 days after they come down to your farm and pull that sample that you have to get that crop out of the field. Not 15 days after you get the test back. There was some confusion on that this year, but ODA has it right on their website. 15 days after the day they come out and take that sample at your farm, you must have that hemp harvested. So then that comes the case of question of, okay, well, what if my THC levels come back too high and I already have it harvested? Well, you can either request to destroy that crop, which you have to request a procedure to do that, or you can have them pay to come back out and test that crop again once it's been harvested, which is again is another cost. Now, the application window for those that are going to be interested, this year was a little different, but every year here on out will be November 1st to March 31st is when that application window will open up. For outdoor growing location, I have a lot of S's in there, sticky finger, but you can have no less than 1/4 of an acre size when you're reporting that. So you must have at least 1/4 of an acre and at least 1,000 plants. So as we talk about plant costs here in just a second, we can't just plant 50 plants and try and manage that if we're trying to keep our budgets low. We have to have 1,000. So you're looking at a minimum of spending. This year, I believe most people got their plants for about $2 a transplant. So we're looking at $2,000 right there, minimum in plants. Now, keep in mind, prices are going to fluctuate, but this year we're looking at a $2,000 minimum for plants. If you're doing indoor growing locations, again, I think you still have to have the 1,000 plants, but you have to have a minimum of at least 1,000 acres square feet indoors. And I thought of something there, Christine, that I forgot to mention on the last slide as we talk about processors. I don't think we have anyone on here that's interested in that, but I should mention we had very, very low numbers do that in Ohio this year because it's almost the chicken and the egg thing, right? Which one's going to come first? So the processor is going to develop so the growers can have somewhere to take this crop to, or the grower is going to establish so the processors can afford to develop their business because it is a large startup cost. And I know we had less than, I want to say less than 5 really go through with it for CBD extraction. And I don't know any that are actually up and running at this point. So again,
where would be the closest one to us?
The closest one that I knew that I was aware of were in Kentucky. There was a couple in Kentucky. There was some down towards Maysville, which is just across the river from us in Brown County. That the Kentucky ones are the only ones that I'm aware of. So there's your transportation costs. So we look at where most of the CBD production was at this year, Southern Ohio. That's because most were probably planning on taking their crop to Kentucky. Now, we get into a lot of that fell through. You can look up, I'm not going to mention a whole lot of specific companies, but I would suggest you take a look at some of the lawsuits that happened this year from grower and processor and buyer fallouts, broken promises. I'm sure you've read about it. It happens. It happened a lot this year. We had a lot of different buyers in Kentucky who had offered contracts in the past that didn't offer contracts. So growing without a contract is pretty dangerous too. And that doesn't guarantee you anything. You're just hoping at the end of the year they decide they want the product, which from those buyers aspect, they can't make that promise right now because of the prices. So it's understandable on both ends, but it does happen, and it's gotten pretty ugly in some cases.
James, one other question I thought of before we move on.
Yes.
Do you have to transplant, or can you start from seed?
You can start from seed. Now, if we're talking for grain and fiber, obviously you're going to be doing some seed there. For CBD, we're going to, let's jump to that here in just a second, Christine. I've got a slide I want to show that's going to hopefully explain that just a little bit. We're going to jump to that when we get into production. Remind me to answer that question, but I got a picture I want to show that hopefully explains it. So again, let's finish up with, I'm not going to run through all these, but you really need to take a look at ODA's website and figure out also the growing locations, where you're allowed to grow. You can't have it within 100 feet of any structure that is used for residential purposes. An outdoor growing location, we talked about some of those minimum requirements, but also within schools or public parks, and also medical marijuana licensed cultivators. So before you jump into it, you should also check out the growing site requirements. Now, here's the website. I created a short link because I tried to put the link on here and it was just massively long. And I know this is something that's easy to write down. So if you go to go.osu.edu/Ohio Hemp Regs, you can find ODA's website that has all of their information for the growing requirements and the application process, how to get signed up. Their phone number is listed there, and also their email is hemp@agra.ohio.gov. And we're going to talk about here in just a second the seed versus the CBD varieties, and there's multiple uses. So depending on what you use it for, you can use it for multiple things. I mean, I know they've been using it for craft beer, for flavoring, for that, of course, medicinal purposes. And if using it for a fiber, you can talk about rope. I know they've used insulation out of it and different other textiles. Okay, so as we get to talking about the drilled production. So here's where we want to have seed, right, Christine? So we're doing a large, massive population for fiber production. And the reason is because we want really small stalks, but a lot of density, because we're using that outside edge of those stalks, not necessarily the exterior of the leaves or anything. We're using a lot of that stalk. We're going to let that break down. So here's where we want the seeds. Now, you can see this is an example of a very large operation, but it can be baled up and sold. But again, processing on this side is very limited as well. And Lee Beers has been working, he has a research project up in his neck of the woods on some fiber production. And he's going to be more of the one to ask about that. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time there. I just wanted to touch base on some of the different production methods. So there's basts and herds that we talk about. So the inside and the outside are the basts and herds here. We want that outside to be in large quantity. So that's what they're going to use for a lot of the fiber production. And I mentioned planting it in high densities. As you can see on the left side of the screen there, we have a large exterior around that. So that's the product that we want. Whereas we go into less dense populations, we get more of that bigger stalk. We really want a lot of little stalks across that field. Grain production, you can see they're planting those in large populations as well and using a lot of the buying and planting as seed there. Okay, so now for CBD, do we want to buy seed or do we want to buy transplants? Well, the main reason we want to buy transplants at this point is because we really do not have a very well established and certified seed program for much of the hemp production for CBD. And the germination rates are very, very low with seeds right now because we just haven't had time to establish it. So what we're talking for most of our grain crops, we want to be up around 80, 90% germination, right? We hopefully are up in the 90 percentile. With CBD, we've been anywhere between 20, 50, 40. I was talking to some folks out of North Carolina. They had 40% probably average in some of their research plots of seed of germination. So you definitely, for the cost of seed, you don't want to take that chance. But really, the main reason too is we want to make sure we have female-only plants for CBD production. The male plants, they're going to put most of their energy late into the growing stage into seed production. Here we want the flower production because we want all the CBD and the bud to develop. So you can see there on the left is a male plant. You can see those seeds coming off that node there. And then of course with other female plants, we'll be looking for those pistils that show up on the stems as well. Does that answer your question there, Christine? A couple reasons is germination, but also we want to avoid getting a huge mix of male plants because we have to if we get male plants, we have to go through and rogue all of those out. Because if they cross-pollinate, then that's going to really take down our CBD production in the field.
Yeah, thank you, James.
Yes.
I was just thinking about reducing some kind of hand labor, but if you see, then you still have to go through and thin out those plants. So makes sense.
And a lot of people want to try it because of the reduced cost too and reduced labor, but it just adds to the risk that we already have. All right, so now I'm just going to jump through. Here we go for production. So if you got questions at this point, feel free to jump in, cut me off. We'll answer any questions. And I'll check how we're doing on time here. So, okay. So when we talk about CBD production, we're going to be growing this. You can see here spaced out, drip irrigation, and plasticulture. You do not have to. This is just a model that most are using at this point. One, because we have very, very limited weed control options. Really no chemical weed control options, because what's the reasoning for that? They don't want us to have them? No, it's so new, right? We don't have the labeling specified on that label where it says, yes, it can be used for hemp production. So when you get a label of atrazine or anything, it's going to tell you what it can be used for, and the crops are listed on that. We really haven't had the time for that licensing process to be approved for a lot of those chemicals for hemp. We don't have Roundup Ready hemp at this point. So there's a lot of hurdles there for chemical control. So we have to use that plasticulture to help reduce the weed competition near the base of the plant, but also spreading out those rows for a couple reasons. For plant spacing to allow for airflow. We don't want those plants to draw a lot of moisture and stay wet, so we have to leave room for air to blow through there. And then also for us to be able to get down in between those rows, once they get into that vegetative state and start bushing out, we have to be able to get down through there and control the weeds. Now again, before we even begin the season, we have to talk about if we're going to use a plasticulture model, the drip irrigation and plastic mulch. Just using a rough estimate, you may find it cheaper, may find it more expensive, but probably anywhere between $700 to $1,800 in an acre spot. So if you're looking at doing about 2,000 plants at about 6 foot row spacing, I'd say you're looking at about $700 to $800 for that model. And fertilizer, probably anywhere between $100 and $200 to get started out. By the time you factor in the cost for fertilizer and also the application if you're paying somebody to applicate it. And then of course the transplants, we're probably looking at $2 each. So most of the time we're looking at about 2,000 plants in an acre spot to 1,500 plants. So you're looking at between $1,500 or $4,000 if you're going to have 2,000 plants in there. So given that 2,000 plants per acre, $2 each, we're looking at about $4,800 at planting. So we have to add that on top of our $600 to $700 for our applications and licensing and everything else. So we're already up above $5,000 before we get into the season. Now, hopefully that's a large portion of our costs taken off there. But there's still, that's a consideration. And I didn't add a whole lot of these numbers last time because they do fluctuate. Don't hold me to these numbers. But talking to growers this year, they said they wish they would have just had some sort of an idea of what these costs look like. And that's just a rough estimate. So you can see kind of how we do it here. So if you're familiar with the tobacco model or tobacco production, which again, a lot of Southern Ohio is, especially our Adams County and Brown County areas, they were really excited about this, right? Because they had probably a lot of the equipment to do this production. And we had probably the first program I had in November to talk about this, and we had probably 60 growers come to that. And again, we only had 3 producers grow in the county this year. So that shows you just, it sounded like a really good idea up front, right? We have the equipment to do it. It's going to work out, but there's just so much we don't know that a lot of people would turn a lot of people away from it. And I don't intend to do that during the presentations, but it's not right for us to try and make it sound like it's going to be a great process. Any farming process is going to have its challenges, but another thing that we struggle with extension is this was our first time too. So I, myself included, and I'm sure all of you, go to Christine for every forage question you have. She's the master on it, right? We don't have a master for hemp in Ohio yet. We didn't have anyone to turn to. So unfortunately for a lot of these growers, without looking to Kentucky or someone else with a lot of experience, it was hard to find that expert advice in the county, in the state. And it's just the nature of the beast. So any questions? You can see, I guess, we put the transplants up there. It has a water wheel on it. So if you look right there beside that gentleman's arm right there on the right side, you can see that has spikes on it. So that pokes a hole in the plastic. We set that transplant down in there, cover that back up, and it also has water. You can see the tanks up there. You can put water or fertilizer to help get those started at the beginning. And that's really where you're setting your plant spacing. So most people, I'd say the common average plant spacing is about 3.5 feet from plant to plant. Now, if you look from the center of his hand to the center of that next row, those are a little bit wider. I think those were about 8 feet plantings. This is from our plot last year. And that's about 8 foot from center to center. I'd say most probably have been using about 6 foot center to center. So now the rest of the pictures here, the previous picture was from our research plot that we partnered with Acela CBD last year. Everything else is going to be from growers here this year. This is, I'm going to add the picture credits to the farm that I work with here. So Creek's Edge Farm in Brown County. I took a lot of pictures of their farm. They provided a lot of pictures for me to use. Now, this is a pump that they have on their farm. You can see that if you look towards the back of this photo, you see the stakes going down through there. That's where they have their water line ran to their pump, which they're irrigating water out of a creek. So there's our first consideration for growing once we get into the season 2. What's our water source? We have to have very large quantity. And just to give you an idea, I talked to a couple producers, and that's a big debate right now, is how much to water and when to water. The best practice for that really is still to be determined, but we had people putting on about 8,000 gallons probably every week to 4,000 gallons every week. That is a lot of water we have to move through. We got dry this year, abnormally dry compared to the last 2 years. So during those times, they had to water a lot. One producer said one time or a couple times throughout that drought period, he had to put on 8,000 gallons a couple times a week. And it's important to remember when we're looking at hemp, and you're going to see pictures here in just a second, it does not like to be drought stressed, and it doesn't like to have extremely wet feet, but it likes to have water on a consistent basis. That's a very, very fine line and a very hard lesson that a lot of people learn throughout this year. So that's probably my lesson 1, is the watering is very, very touchy. Beginning of the year, a lot of people were just trying to keep it wet. That way it had moisture. We don't want to let it get it dry. This is our baby we're taking care of, right? So don't let it get stressed, but it does not like wet feet. So you can see here this dual tank, that is the sand filtration system. So we're probably looking, again, I'm just throwing out rough estimates here from a local source. The pump that's down towards the creek, we're looking anywhere between $1,000 to $2,000 for a gas pump. Electric, we're probably a lot cheaper, and you can find definitely a lot more expensive. These filters, we're probably looking anywhere between $1,000 to $2,000 for those filters as well. Now you can see back here on the cart, they have a tank that they have, and what they use that for is to inject their fertilizer. So another thing to consider is if we're doing this, the fertilization, we have to keep fertilizing throughout the year. And as these rows, as you can see on my screen behind me, get very tight. So we have to be able to irrigate and fertigate that fertilizer down through those rows. And then we'll show you some more here of where this blue line, the main hose running out to, what that looks like. So what we do is now that blue hose runs out and we run that drip irrigation line down to each one of those single rows. And of course they had it set up where they could shut off one side or the other. As you can see, this field from the right side of your screen to the left side of your screen is a little rolling. So at times, if it was a little more, the soil had some moisture to it, they could irrigate the top a little heavier and just count on that runoff and that the wetter lying areas they didn't have to water. So again, another management step, have areas, if you have different parts of your field that lay different, this bottom portion of the field here on the left stayed wet, so they didn't have to irrigate quite as often. So this was their field 2 weeks after planting. We're looking probably, they planted, I believe the date was June 15th. So we're looking here at the end of June, early July is what this field looked like. Now, I didn't include a picture of it. But you can see these beds. So when we lay these beds, we also have to keep in mind that we have to find the equipment to a bed layer, right? So we have to find the equipment to raise these beds with. You probably don't want to buy them if you're just planning on doing it for 1 year, because that's going to be an expensive cost too. And then also a plastic layer. So there's a lot of equipment that's involved just in this process here of getting those beds up, getting the drip line down, and getting the plastic on top of that. So again, the second picture here, that's again the same week, about 2 weeks after they're transplanted. Now we get into late July. You can see this crop is typically, I'd say on average, about a 90 to 100-day crop. It moves along pretty quick. And we get that vegetative state early on in the year as they start growing vegetatively. And once our daylight hours start getting shorter, so less than 12 hours, they start going into the reproductive stage. So they start putting on their buds. In late July, I'm going to get a shot down through here. Okay, so another tip from this producer, talking to them, they planted really early on, okay? And you're going to see as we go on throughout this presentation, I want you to see the stages of this growth. So they did 6 foot center to center. So from left to right on the centers, they did 6 foot. And then between plant to plant, they did 3.5. And when you're making this out on paper and you're drawing it out, it works perfect, right? Oh, that'll be perfect. It gives us plenty of space in between rows and plenty of space in between plants. But they planted very early. So what did I say? Before the daylight hours start shortening, they start vegetative production, right? So if you plant early on in the year, you're going to have a lot more vegetative production. They're going to get bigger. So you have to account for that. If your planting date is going to be early, you know you're going to have bigger plants. We have to space them out a little bit further. That'd be one tip I have. If you're planning on planting later, you can get by with some narrower rows. So that kind of goes into the planting stage. A lot of times that we skip, your planting date can have a big effect on how big your plants are going to get. So at this point, they look really good. As you can see, they have to go down through each one of these rows and keep these weeds down. And they did a very nice job of it. But you can see just within a couple, probably within a month, these weeds are pretty close. If they'd let them go through the rest of the year, these plants would be hidden by these weeds. And then when we get into late July, The perfect production doesn't exist. We're going to have issues. So we ended up having some fungal pathogens show up, and we ended up sending this out to the lab in Kentucky, and they helped us identify this pathogen. And really the bad thing to do here, or the bad thing about this is, again, we have very limited chemical options in control for hemp right now for the same reasons. As you can see here, if you take a look at the soil around this plant, we had very hot weather in July. And as I mentioned, they were watering quite often really early on. So that soil stayed very wet. You add that high heat, high humidity, and what do we put on top of that? Plastic. So we're just kind of retaining that high humidity in that plastic, and it just creates a perfect condition for these type of issues to arise. And that's when we want to say, that's when we want to come back to what we said about making sure we water enough to keep water there, but not to keep the soil wet at all times, especially when we're using plastic model. So then we also started noticing some yellowing, which again was probably due to some of the watering stress, but we didn't know, maybe it was a nutrient. We just didn't know a whole lot at this point. So we sent it out for testing of both. For we did a tissue sampling, and we also sent it out to our OSU lab for a bacterial test. So if you take a look here, you can see on the left side, they have those big brown spots, right? And again, we saw a little bit of yellowing, but by mid-August, they were very large. And you can see how these plants are closing in just within another month. We get from early July into mid-August, these plants have grown another foot and probably another foot wider. And we're going to go over some of what those diseases were in just a second. So again, mid-August, you can see these rows are starting to close in. And if you're trying to keep the weeds down, then it becomes pretty difficult. If you're going down through with a weed eater or a lawnmower, weed eater is probably your only option at this point. They really wanted to be able to take a lawnmower down through there and keep the rows clean and save some time. But they really had to go do some mechanical weed control and spend a lot of time out in the field doing that. Just another example of this same field by the time we get to mid-August. And we started seeing probably towards the late August, those flowers beginning to develop on the leaves. So now things started to happen. We started seeing the flowers develop by the end of August. And we also saw this develop. So a second leaf disease, we had some root issues going on, and now we have two different leaf diseases showing up. And this almost looks like, if you're familiar with frog eye in soybeans, to me that looks a lot like frog eye. So we also sent this out for testing and came back, and we're going to talk about it, but this was hemp leaf spot. And University of Kentucky has been dealing with this and is actually doing some research on this now. And the best advice we got is there's a whole lot we don't know about it. As far as control, there's just not a whole lot we can do. And I know that's an answer as a producer that you hate to hear, but it's just so new, we just don't have the answers right now. But now, fortunately, as we get on into the year, these issues didn't cause a whole lot of problems as we know of right now on the buds themselves, but they did obviously cause some leaf drop issues and some not very aesthetic leaves. So as far as the bud goes and as far as the THC and CBD levels go, it doesn't seem like we had much of an issue at this point. Okay, so now we're going to get into some of the testing, what we did throughout the year. Got to keep moving along here. So what we did, we had a system, we used a Eurofins infrared system to do testing, a guesstimate, I should say, down at our OSU South Centers in Piketon. And we just used this. This is not a certified way. ODA has the certified way to do THC and CBD testing. But this was taken back in, this was August, I thought I had the dates on here, but this was actually back middle of August. So I think this was the 18th. August 18th was when we pulled the first sample, and you can see our THC levels were about, on average, about 0.1, 0.10 or so THC levels on our first one up here at the top. And our CBD levels, no buds yet, were about 1 to 2%. As we jump down below that line there, we look at that second set. That was taken August 28th. And our THC levels pretty much stayed the same. We didn't have a whole lot of jump. And again, still at this point, no buds were on those plants. And the CBD levels were still pretty low, about a half to 1 to 2% on the CBD levels. So you can see, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but the total CBD is what we want to pay attention to. And then we look at the total THC that I have highlighted. That's what we want to pay attention to. You can see that there's THC, there's a delta 9, THCA. Those are going to be combined together when ODA does the report into the total THC. So that's what we have to make sure we're aware of. So then we said we had those issues developing on the leaf. We sent those plant tissue samples in, and we came up with, really the levels were great. We didn't really have, there was a few that were maybe a little low, but not completely deficient. And so we could rule out, they didn't have much of a nutrient issue. And for some growers, this is good news because they didn't apply any nitrogen or any fertilizer up front. This was a fallow field, just grass field that they had used. And they, of course, applied some fish emulsion and some organic, they did an organic model. They used some organic fertilizers, which are pretty low in their nutrient levels. So they really didn't apply a whole lot of fertilizer, and their nutrient levels were still pretty good. So we were a little concerned about them not having fertilizer on up front, but it actually panned out, and they did save some costs there. But again, we also had a soil sample taken on this field. Their levels were good prior to starting as well. So when the lab came back from OSU, it was actually that Pseudomonas bacteria, which I do not know a whole lot about, but Dr. Krasinski said that this is found on many types of plants, including flowers and other types of crops throughout the state. So it's a very common bacteria. And again, we don't know the best control options for hemp at this time. But at least we know what some of those are going to be, what some of the possibilities that are going to affect hemp. Early September, you can see that hemp leaf spot here, not the brown spots that we looked at were really the bacteria from the OSU lab, but from Kentucky, that hemp leaf spot had really taken over a lot of the plants. And again, in case you're wondering if there's anybody that's really interested in what these were, we have the highlighted name there for the bacteria that was found. So there's two types of bacteria just to keep your eye on, or a fungus for the state of Ohio that we're aware that can affect it. And then this was from this week. This was from the Monday. We were out there working with these producers, and you can see how big these plants got. They were huge. Some of them were up above my head, which doesn't say a whole lot. I'm not that tall, but some of them were 6 foot tall or better. And there were plenty of buds all over the plants, but you can see this was a nice clean row. Some of them were a little narrower, but that row spacing is something we want to consider. And they did a great job of keeping the weeds down there with those plants. So we're just probably right at 90 days of growth on the 15th. And this is what 90 days of growth look like for these producers. You can see the bud there on those. Those are some of the buds. And if you look real closely, you can see those tiny little white specks all over the buds. Those are the trichomes. And when we're talking about in terms of final, I guess, maturity for CBD production, you can really take your phone. This was just taken with an iPad. You can take your phone and zoom in on those buds and see those trichomes. When they're turning from a milky white to a more of an amber color, that's when they really recommend that they're harvest ready. Now, of course, we're going to show here in just a second, the THC and CBD levels go as we get more mature, right? Because that's where a lot of our cannabinoids are going to be held. So a big healthy bud there on the left side, that is a really big one. But here's some, as I talk about the wet-lying, low-lying areas of that field, they just stayed wet, right? They couldn't handle it. That's what some of these plants look like. We had great parts of that field, but the water is probably one of the biggest lessons we learned this year. Laying out your field, make sure you take a look at the drainage. For most of this field, it was great. You know, it had a great slope to it. We just had one little swell on that field, and it really affected probably close to probably 100 or so plants of that field that really lost a lot of leaves and a lot of buds. So combining all three testings, we took the testings from Friday of last week, and they were tested and just got to me this week. And what we ended up as we get the buds put on them, the first two testings, remember, we look at the total THC that I have highlighted there. You go on down, they stayed low, right? We get those buds developed, all of a sudden we're up to 0.2, 0.3. We really jumped. And as they go to mature, you'll see from that milky to amber color, those will continue to go. So harvest timing becomes very, very important tool that we have to use. And I mentioned testing throughout the year is a very nice tool. We really don't have that option. This is the only option we had, and we got lucky enough to be able to use the system probably for this year only. We probably won't have this luxury next year to use it. So we wanted to try and collect as much data as we can to learn how these THC levels kind of run throughout the season while we had the chance. And we take a look here, the third column from the right, the total CBD percent, you can see how they change throughout the year too. Once we get the buds on, we're up around 4.5 to 4.6, which is pretty good. Probably we want to be up around that 6 or plus range, but anytime we see CBD and THC go up, they go up and down together. Whatever that plant does to make that level go up, we're seeing they do correlate, they do go up together. So it's a fine line. We want high CBD, but we have to keep in mind that's going to climb with our THC. Okay. So this was the second farm. They used more of a tobacco model, right? They used a wide plant spacing. They didn't do raised beds. They didn't do plastic. They didn't do drip irrigation. And they were planted about the same time. June 18th, I believe, was their planting date. And they did a great job with weed control. And there's nothing wrong with this model. I mean, this was a much lower input model. We tell people don't invest more than you're not willing to lose. And this was a lower risk. This was a lower risk option. And they still had a lot of healthy plants. They watered using a pond that they had, and they watered with a hose. Now, if you're going to do that, we really recommend not watering the tops of those plants. We don't want to keep those leaf surfaces wet. We want to water towards the base of the plant. The thing with that, this is still probably 1,500 plants. They had to go through and individually water each and every plant. If you have the time, that's great. But you have to set aside the time. And the producer will tell you, he started at 2:30 in the morning watering. And he would water clear throughout the afternoon. That way those plants had time to dry out. So it takes a lot of time to do that. So this was about June 30th for these plants. We're about 30 days into the growing season for them. We started seeing some leaf deficiencies and plants dying off. Probably 30 to 40% of their field was in a low-lying area. When we got those heavy rains, they stayed wet, and we lost a lot of them. And here they are on September 4th. You can see here the trichomes are developing up on these buds as well. So you can see, if you look towards the back part of the property there, they were nice, big, healthy, bushy plants. We get towards this front, that's where that water laid. And it really wasn't a whole lot. It was just enough. They stayed wetter than they intended to, and that really had an effect on it. And they just didn't get up to size, and they had a lot of leaf issues going on with that portion of the field. Now, the rest of the field looked great. And you can tell they definitely didn't get as big, even though they were just a couple weeks behind. And here's just an example of their THC and CBD levels. They were a little bit higher going into the first week of September, but they were also a little bit further. They didn't have as much vegetative growth, right? So they didn't get as big. They put buds on earlier and mature earlier. So that's something to keep in mind too. If you want them to mature earlier and put on less buds, but have it out of the field sooner, a later planting date can kind of help you do that. Again, here's this week. We were just out there taking some samples and taking a look at the field. That's the final size. They're about 3 to 4 foot tall in parts of that field. Now, as far as most of what we see pest-wise, I didn't see a whole lot of pests in the field this year. I didn't see a lot of leaf feeding. I didn't see a whole lot of soil insect damage. We just had a lot of leaf diseases. So that's another lesson this year is we know we are going to have our humid conditions. We are going to have a lot of leaf diseases. Pythium, again, we had that issue early on with the picture we showed earlier, and southern blight. The picture I showed you that had the white fungus on it, that was southern blight. And they find that to happen a lot in those fields that were planted that used to be pastures. And this was actually just a grass field. So again, that could be where we came into some of those issues. Now, harvesting and drying, we haven't even got to this portion yet. Won't spend a whole lot of time on it. I wanted to get you kind of through the growing season. But this is the next step. Time consuming. We have to find a way to cut it individually with a pair of loppers. Or some people have used like the weed eaters with the blades on the end of them. They're very thick stalk, very woody stalk. They're not like tobacco. They're very woody. So this is one way you can see them. They have them strung here on a string down to different rows from the rafters. And here was a field from Kentucky last year in an old tobacco barn. They used tobacco sticks and shoved them down onto the tobacco sticks and let them air out. Now this was a little tight. You got to make sure you have airflow going through there to make sure, because when you put those in there, they're very sticky. They're very high moisture, and the centers of those can easily mold if you don't get a lot of air blowing through there. So you have to have a lot of space to put these plants up. You can see a 2,000 acre field, like the one behind me and the one we've showed, that's about how much room, 2,000 acre, 2,000 plant field, 2,000 acres don't go there. 2,000 plant field, that's about the area you're going to need for harvesting and drying. And the other side of this barn was just as full. Another method, this is what one producer is doing to kind of on a smaller scale, dry the buds out a little bit faster. They're cutting them off the stem and they're going to hang them out in a nice, cool, dark area to let them just kind of dry out on their own and get some airflow to them. In the strip material, you have to strip all that off once you're done, right? So all of this has to be dried and stripped off the branches manually by hand, which takes a lot of time as well. We'll get to the marketing and how this is priced. So typically it's priced per percent of CBD. So we want to have, so recently the prices have been very low, $1 per percent of CBD. So in this case, we're getting about a pound per plant. So we're looking at about $4 per plant. And that makes it pretty hard to get a return on that as we know what those initial costs were. We were up around $6,000 easy just getting started. And with prices where they're at right now, this was you can see I have the link down here at the bottom, a budget from the University of Kentucky that you can use. You can follow that link, hemp.ca.uky.edu. And you can put in all of your numbers and it gives you a price for your input costs and your possible revenue. So at 4%, what this farm had at the prices they have right now, if that's what they get, it's about $5,700 what they'd be looking at on a rough estimate on a return. So a pretty small margin there. And one more resource, I want to save time for questions. I know we're running pretty short, I'm windy. But here's a great resource. If you want some reading material just to have in front of you, Central State University did a great job. Dr. Schoenhofer there did a great job of putting this fact sheet together in partnership with ODA. So this is a great resource for Ohio. If you need that sent to you, I can send it. Here's the link, Christine. If you want to put that in the chat box, you can use that too. But I know I got quick there at the end, but any questions on that? I think I covered everything. And one thing to mention, I do have, again, 3 producers in the county. And as I know of at this time, I talked to them last week, they do not have a guaranteed market outlet at this point. So we're getting ready for harvest. We know what that cost was. We know what the time was. And we still don't have a guaranteed handwritten set of prices or any buyer's agreement at all.
James, you did great.
Thanks. I know that was a lot to go through there.
You shared a lot with us in a short time. I am putting that link in the chat box right now. If anyone has questions, remember if you're on the phone, press *6 to unmute, or you can use the chat box.
So now, is anyone interested in growing hemp next year? I will say I talked to the growers that I showed you most of the pictures from. They said they do plan to grow next year. They're going to do things a lot differently, probably not as many plants. They're going to space them out a lot further, so it makes it easier for them to do some mechanical control on the weeds, but they're definitely going to downsize. So if you're looking at doing it, we recommended people not to go over 1 acre this year. They may be looking at that 1/4 acre mark, the minimum.
Tracy says that she's looking for investors.
Okay. Yeah. For the production or processing, I know we had a couple people looking for investors to get a processing facility started in Southern Ohio. And here's the thing. Here's something we should probably mention. I didn't add the chart because it's not updated. I had a chart that they gave me a monthly report on the prices of CBD. As we would see, it was $1 a pound or $1 per percent, right? Back in 2018, when we had this big boom, it was a huge thing. People were getting rich off of it, right? Prices were up around like, I don't know, $10, $12 per percent. We're down below $1 now. I mean, this fall we hit 72 cents. We just outgrew our market. You know, our production, we just flooded the market, and it's basic economics, right? We oversupply, and the demand, we really don't have it there yet, so the prices go down. We just kind of got too far ahead of ourselves on the production side. And back when that was $10 to $15 a pound or a percent, yeah, there was money to be made. And then that was when everybody was jumping on board. So they weren't lying. It wasn't like there was a big exaggeration. At that time, it was a pretty good investment. I guess the only thing I forgot to mention as I'm going through here is crop insurance. Christine and I talked about that early on. There is no crop insurance that I am aware of for the state other than through USDA. I believe they have the NAP program, the non-insured crop program. But again, that only covers natural disasters if I'm correct on that. I think it only covers natural disasters. So if your THC is too high, you have to destroy your crop, that doesn't cover it. If you have wet area and you just didn't have those plants produce like you thought they should, that's not going to cover it. It has to be an approved disaster for that to be able to be insured.
James, I see in the chat box, Tracy says, great presentation, thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
What happens if you don't harvest it? Will it die at frost?
So interestingly enough, last year we did the research project, so-called research project, for the limited time we had. We didn't get that planted until middle of August. So what we did, we kept lights on it at night to keep it growing, but we let it go just kind of to see what would happen. And we had the first frost come in, and they handled it pretty well. Now, we were a little concerned as we talk about possible spikes of THC being drought stress, or any really stress to that plant can really spike those THC levels. So we were wondering to see if those THC levels would go up after the frost. We had a good big cold snap. They went up a little bit, but I think it was more of we lost moisture in the plant and they were more concentrated. We didn't have a direct correlation to what those THC levels did. Now, after about 2 to 3 frosts, by the time that thing got into late November, those leaves really fell off and they were essentially by December just stems out there in the field. So I would say if it gets a frost on, if you got planted late, it gets hit, you've probably got a couple weeks, I would say, or a week at the most to get those harvested before they really go south.
Another question I had was during harvest, how delicate are those plants? Do you risk losing the buds if you're too rough in transport?
Not really. I've seen people throw them in tubs in the field and squash them down in there and throw them on a wagon. They're really pretty. They're not going to fall off because they're pretty tough. And those trichomes, they're really sticky, so they're not going to knock off a lot of those trichomes or anything like that either. They're pretty tough, so you don't have to worry too much about handling as far as that goes.
Awesome. Any additional questions for James this morning? We will be posting the recording. So if you have friends or you need to rewatch for yourself, you'll be able to access that on the Noble County website, which is noble.osu.edu. I will get the video loaded and uploaded today. It should be there by this afternoon. And we'll also have it posted on social media by Tuesday. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us. And thank you, James, for your time this morning.
No problem. And Christine, I did at both farms a couple of videos to try and make it a field day style. So I don't know when I'll get those edited and all cleaned up and put together, but that'll be a resource hopefully we have by winter as well.
Great. James, what's your email?
Oh, sorry, I should have put that
I'll
on
put it in the chat for you.
Morris.1677.
1677?
Yep.
Okay. So that's morris.1677 at osu.edu if you have additional questions. Okay, with that, I will end the recording.